Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the professor, and this is the moment of truth.
I mean, what type of reparations will the task force recommend, you think, and who will be eligible for those reparations? There are so many different ideas that are possible. Lay out for us what you guys are going to do.
Yes. So, as I said earlier, this first year has marked the study phase. We're now transitioning to the development stage. We have this 500-page report that's chock full of data and testimony that essentially is, serves as an evidentiary record that substantiates a very clear claim for African Americans on the local, state, and federal level. We have another report that we're releasing next summer, which will be our final report, and that will include our final comprehensive reparations plan. I can't say for sure what's going to be in that plan, but I can say that our recommendations must comport with international human rights law standards. And under international law, there are 5 forms of reparations. Compensation or cash or a check is one of them. There's also rehabilitation, restitution, guarantees of non-repetition, and satisfaction.
That's really helpful. Camila Moore. Oh, go ahead, quickly.
Yeah, in terms of eligibility, the task force came to a historic 5-4 decision to affirm what we call lineage-based reparations. So those who would be eligible for reparations in the state are those who are descendants of free and enslaved Black people who were here prior to 1900.
That is important to add in there at the end.
White supremacy loves to put us in trick bags, but how do you con someone into jumping into a trick bag, especially people who are aware and careful? Well, the trick bag has to be carefully woven, using weasel words. And that's what we're seeing happening here when it comes to the reparations discourse. Now, let me say right off top, this morning's briefing is not going to please a lot of people. There are going to be some folks who have an issue with what it is that I'm saying, but when I see something that I know to be out of order, I'm going to call it out. And listening to what this Camila Moore woman said has sent up so many red flags, you know I'm going to have to speak on this. Now, I didn't make you suffer through the entire insipid segment on Zerlina, who is just more proof that the white media chooses its shills very well, or rather very poorly. But she waited until the very end, at the very end of this doggone segment, before she finally asked, and who qualifies? Hurry up, and putting a rush on. We need to go ahead and go by this very quickly. We don't want to offend any of those white liberals out there. And this is supposed to be programming that's in Black people's interest. And what is their idea of who it should apply to?
Lineage-based reparations. So those who would be eligible for reparations in the state are those who are descendants of free and enslaved Black people who were here prior to 1900.
Lineage-based reparations. Yeah, but lineage based on what? We have made it clear that that lineage must go back to a particular circumstance and event. That is the totality of what we've been talking about. But this Moore woman and her task force, they've thrown that completely out the window. This so-called task force has now invented an entirely new definition of reparations that is no longer about what happened to your ancestors, but as she herself has said, now it's simply about when did you get to the U.S., regardless of your circumstances, prior to 1900. So this is already being expanded way beyond chattel slavery. It's going on to an additional 35 years afterwards, when you had the enormous waves of migrants coming to the United States in the late 1800s. Now, I'm an armchair linguist, so I pay real good attention when people speak. Now, because the Black grassroots, led by the new voices of Black media, have done everything to push reparations to the forefront, now you have these folks coming along and they're trying to use our language, our lingo, but for what purpose? They're not using it the way that we use it. That's why her definition of who qualifies started off with free Black people. Did you notice that?
Those who are descendants of free and enslaved Black people who were here prior to 1900.
When she said who it is who would qualify, she didn't say Black people who had been enslaved in this country. She started off with free Black people first. That's meant to set a prioritization in people's minds. She said enslaved Black people last. Even her very words downplay and minimize what reparations is all about. She's literally talking about chattel slaves as nothing but an afterthought. Because free Black people applies to every immigrant who managed to get here before 1900. And of course, Zerlina doesn't challenge her on this. No one does, because this is what they want. They want for this false, fraudulent definition of reparations to be repeated enough times that hopefully it will take hold in the public mind. This every black person prior to 1900 crap, that's just a way to grandfather clause in all the immigrants into this, and then from there they will expand it to people of color, and finally it's going to include every Caucasian who claims that one of their ancestors might have been mistreated at some point in time. You can bet the Irish and the Italians will be all over that one. The entire foundation of reparations is what happened to black people in this country who were here. But this task force has manufactured a new definition that is meant to divorce chattel slavery from reparations, and it can apply to practically anybody. And we've been warning about this for years, telling you that people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other women of color, they would always be trying to piggyback and shoehorn themselves into the reparations discussion. Every time some black person brings up reparations, here comes Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who, by the way, famously said, "I got black ancestry, that doesn't make me black." And yet you bring up reparations, she says, "Well, don't forget about us. You got to include us in that too." Even though a lot of people like her come from cultures and countries that practice violent anti-black racism. And most of them classify themselves as white. So what this Moore woman is doing here, this is not some victimless crime. This is not harmless. This is what the plan clearly was from the very beginning. So this is about giving something to people who were never enslaved. That's why they decided that they were going to set a cutoff date at 1900. This has got to already from the jump, it's got to immediately be expanded beyond slavery. We can't just stop with slavery. This can't just be about black people. They're setting the stage for it right in front of you. This is a historical abomination and a racist lie. When it comes to the greatest crime in human history, there are no ifs, ands, or buts. Either you can trace your lineage back to the killing fields of the American South, or you can't. And if you can't, then it doesn't apply to you. I mean, what slaves got here to the U.S. in the year 1880 or 1890 or 1895? How many slaves were still being brought to the U.S. in the 1870s, 80s, or 90s? She's sitting here saying before 1900, oh, the U.S. was still importing black people into the country on slave ships then? Anyone who cannot trace their lineage back to the plantations shouldn't get jack, because they didn't help to build the country. They chose to come here. They made a conscious, deliberate, intentional choice of their own free will, and choices have consequences. Mr. Harvey on his YouTube channel, Your World, he has a little saying he likes to use, which is America was founded by thieves, slaves, and opportunists. And these migrants, they fit into the opportunist category. They chose to come here. And these are the exact same black immigrants who can always be counted on to say that racism doesn't exist in America. They've never encountered racism in America. That their experience has been fundamentally different than black Americans' experience. They can always be counted on to say that. Well, in that case, what do these black immigrants need reparations for? All these black immigrants chose to come here because of the massive wealth that our ancestors created. They made a conscious decision. No one brought them over on a slave ship. And at the very least, it's a lie by omission for Camilla Moore to sit here and actually put slavery into the same sentence as up until 1900. Nobody was being brought over on slave ships in 1899. And having 1900 as the so-called cutoff point, that's a historical fraud. It's just another way of saying that black immigrants or any black people who managed to get here before 1900 need to be shoehorned in. You're not a freeman if you showed up here after 1865. You're just a black immigrant. She's doing trick bag language here, trying to turn this from reparations for slavery into this is meant to address everyone who's experienced racism. Doesn't matter if your ancestors were enslaved or not. Doesn't matter if they were here during chattel slavery or not. If you experienced any sort of racism between 1865 and 1900, why, this is for you too. Because that's when you had a number of these black immigrants and tethers whose folks got here in the years following the American Civil War. All of them chose to come here. Roly-poly Martin's worthless, opportunistic behind, he's been whoring himself to the U.S. government, benefiting from government cash for so long, and he's a Haitian immigrant. He's been getting money from the U.S. government, and he's busily demanding more. It's time that piece of crap tether was told we're cutting him off. Sheila Jackson Lee, Angela Rye with lettuce and tomato on the side, and a number of others, they're literally trying to grandfather clause their way into a conversation that has nothing to do with them. And what this Camilla Moore woman said, she did not misspeak. She wasn't taken out of context before anyone tries that old trope. She said exactly what she meant. This is meant to be the thin end of the wedge. Once they include a few Caribbean immigrants and one or two African migrants at the end of the 19th century, then they'll have the rhetorical basis to say, well, now we have to expand it to include all people who claim to be black. You're going to have a lot of Hispanics who are suddenly going to be saying, well, my abuela, she was black, or my abuelo, and all of a sudden they're going to remember that they claim to have a black ancestor somewhere, though it won't be one whose lineage goes back to the plantations of America. They're just going to say black, period. Even though these people only got here in the last 60 years, suddenly all of a sudden it's going to be about black. Notice I say claim to be, because a sizable portion of these people, they deny being black and then happily claim to be something other than black. And when they think they see a chance to get something, then suddenly they say they're black all of a sudden. That's what's being set up here. The people who came here in the years following the Civil War, after black people had fought for the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to be passed, people who came here to take advantage of the riches that our ancestors created and the laws that we fought to get on the books, they will then perversely claim that they're entitled to what only applies to us. And these people like Camilla Moore, they're going to be smiling and beaming and strutting and lecturing us about why this is a good thing, and we need some cross-racial coalitions, and we need to be building allies, and we don't want to be showing unfriendly face. And everyone suffered under racism here, don't you know? It's not just black people. This is about more than slavery. She's going to wait until after they go ahead and spring the trap next year before she goes ahead and drags out that particular line, though they may not even wait until then. They may go ahead and start slow rolling that line of rhetoric out early. This is a trick bag going on here, and it's so obvious. The so-called task force was meant to bury the issue of reparations in an endless discussion meant to go nowhere, but the grassroots mobilized and put the pressure on them. So they felt like they had to say something. But that wasn't supposed to happen. They were never supposed to be pushed into a corner like that. So when Plan A failed, they resorted to Plan B, which is everybody's going to get something out of it. We're damn sure not going to let it just be limited to the black people who have been historically discriminated against. This needs to apply to everybody, and they're going to do it by degrees. Their goal is to institute an everybody gets a check policy. Just watch. Why do you think they're waiting until next summer to issue their comprehensive report? A report that she says that they can't even tell us what's going to be in it. But trust them, though, it's going to be for the greater good. We can't tell you what's in it, but trust us, this is our reparations proposal. We just can't tell you what's going to be in it, that's all. Oh, so they want it to be a surprise. They want to keep their reparations plan a secret from everyone, including the very black people who it's supposed to be for. This whole thing stinks. They figure a year from now enough time will have passed that they'll be able to quietly change their standard for who ought to qualify, and then they'll add language saying that anyone who identifies as black should qualify even if they only got here last week. Because that's what their goal was from the very beginning. It was only pushback from the black grassroots that made them back up on it, not back off it, but they backed up on it. But then they said, well, we can't just limit it to slavery. It's got to go beyond that.
That our recommendations must comport with international human rights law standards. And under international law, there are 5 forms of reparations. Compensation or cash or a check is one of them. There's also rehabilitation, restitution, guarantees of non-repetition, and satisfaction.
Their reparations plan was going to be one that comports with the international standards for reparations, and that there's 5 international standards for reparations. That's done as a way to dilute what reparations actually are. First of all, she lays out an either-or equation. This is laying the groundwork for a non-monetary fraud that will simply claim to be reparations in name. Now, Ms. Moore figures she can use a phrase like international reparations standards, and most of the time, a lot of people won't even bother to try to check that out or figure out even what it is that she might be referring to, but this is the black media. We believe in doing our homework. Now, I looked up this international reparations standards, and I found it in a UN Assembly resolution from December 2005. And I immediately noticed that in the UN's resolution, they listed restitution before compensation. Now, she mentioned compensation first.
Compensation or cash or a check is one of them. There's also rehabilitation, restitution, guarantees of non-repetition, and satisfaction.
That was meant for us. That was meant for us to hear that and go, oh, well, at least they say compensation. But the international standards that she claims that her reparations plan is going to be based on, they don't list compensation first. They list restitution. Now, you might say that's a distinction without a difference. No, it's not. And the UN's resolution makes that clear. But let's go ahead and take it in the order that she listed it. She said compensation first, and then she blew by it at 1,000,000 miles an hour. That was deliberate. This way, when she and the rest of the task force inevitably get called out on this, she'll be able to say, well, I said check. You can't say I didn't mention check. I said check. This is meant to be a CYA maneuver. But what does Ms. Moore's precious UN Assembly resolution say about compensation? How do they define it? First of all, the examples the UN gives starts off with physical and mental harm. Then it lists lost opportunities, including employment, education, and social benefits. Material damages and loss of earning, including loss of earning potential, moral damage, whatever that is, and finally, costs required for legal and expert assistance, medicine and medical services, and psychological and social services. I find this to be particularly galling. When it comes to talking about Black people and our needs, you always have some bootlicking scumbags who try to shoehorn mental services into the conversation. And the inference is crystal clear. Black people are all crazy, or there's something wrong with all of us. We all got mental problems. This is a classic white supremacist trope, like drapetomania, where slave owners listed it as an irrational mental disorder that Black people wanted to run away from the plantations. Our desire to be free is listed as a mental disease by these white supremacists. The only three things on that compensation list that should have even been there are material damages, lost opportunities, and physical or mental harm, in that order. This isn't about thoughts and feelings. I know a lot of Black people, particularly hood rats, bedwenches, and the like, who look for attention, and they'll be the first to say, I want to talk about my feelings because they want some attention. But that ain't what this is. This is about cash. White supremacy didn't do what it did to us because of feelings. They did it because of material gain. And this is going to be stripping them of their ill-gotten gains. Next, restitution. She purposely doesn't define or clarify what that's supposed to mean, so I'll tell you what the UN defined it as. It means to restore the victim to the original situation before the gross violations of international human rights law or serious violations of international humanitarian law occurred. Restitution includes, as appropriate, restoration of liberty, enjoyment of human rights, identity, family life and citizenship, return to one's place of residence, restoration of employment, and return of property. Now, as you can see in the graphic, that I placed a huge emphasis on the word before, because that's the key word in that statement. Now again, restitution is comprised of restoration of liberty, enjoyment of human rights, identity, citizenship, and return of property before the gross violations of law. As Black people in this country, we cannot be restored to our condition of liberty because we've never had it, not for one single solitary moment in this country. We can't be restored to enjoyment of human rights because this country has fought a nonstop race war against us to attack all of our rights, starting with the very right to live. You cannot name any point in this country's history when we haven't been a people under siege, under threat, and under persecution. When have Black people in this country ever been free? What year was this? Return of property can apply to many of us, but again, this country has done everything it can to make Black impoverishment generational, to establish and maintain a status of a permanent underclass. How can we be restored to a condition that we've never had? So much for restitution. Rehabilitation, a word that she gives no definition of, meaning that it can be a lot of things, but the one thing it won't be is a check, and we know it won't be because the UN's definition says it includes medical and psychological care as well as legal and social services. Gee, wasn't that part of the definition of compensation? So much of the UN standards for reparations has to do with medicine. It reads more like a patient's Bill of Rights. Oh, and by the way, that's all it says. There's nothing else there. I think we're beginning to figure out why your Reparations Task Force is so enamored with the UN standards for reparations. Let me tell you something. These white supremacist doctors, they're the ones who deny Black people medical care all the time. They're the ones who push racist crackpot nonsense meant to justify Black people getting a far lesser level of health care or none whatsoever. We need responsible, competent doctors who we can trust with our health before we start talking about medical care. because right now in the U.S. we don't have medical professionals. We have white supremacists with stethoscopes. And if medical care is your definition of restitution, well, you better understand that we are never going to have restitution as long as we have to go to the people who got us sick in the first place. Next, satisfaction. Again, Moore didn't bother to elaborate, but that's okay because her UN resolution did. The UN resolution defines satisfaction as verification of facts and full and public disclosure of truth. The search for the whereabouts of the disappeared, assistance in finding those killed and give a proper burial, an official declaration restoring the dignity and rights of the victim and of persons closely connected to the victim. In other words, this is just a Truth and Reconciliation Committee just like South Africa had. And I think we all know how much good that did for them. And just to show that it's nothing but a trick bag, the UN satisfaction checklist also has, wait for it, a public apology. There it is. Jonathan Capehart and the bootlicks at the Congressional Reparations Fraud hearing a couple of years back, they'd be proud of this one. A public apology is supposed to be reparations. That train is never late. The only part of that satisfaction list that I would actually approve of was point F, which they put dang near last, about judicial and administrative sanctions against persons liable for the violations. Let's talk about punishment. Because in my world, reparations is best defined as recompense and retribution. Next, you have the guarantees of non-repetition. When you look at what this list is comprised of, we see that this is all but irrelevant to us. This is supposed to be a list of ways to keep the violations that made reparations necessary from happening again. But look at what their points are, and you tell me how relevant these are to us. Ensuring effective civilian control of the military and security forces. The U.S. already has that. Black people have been targets of every civilian group you can name, from the government to private corporations to just racist citizens on the streets. We were not the victims of some rogue general who seized power in a coup or some invading army from abroad. It was the civilian leadership of the U.S. who ran those slave ships. Hell, it was civilian leaders like Thomas Jefferson all the way up to Ulysses Grant who owned and sold black people as slaves. So that point's meaningless. B. Ensuring all civilian and military proceedings abide by international standards of due process, fairness, and impartiality. All you got to do is look at how the courts willfully ignored Bill Cosby's constitutional rights and look at Guantanamo Bay. Neither U.S. civilian nor military proceedings abide by anything other than I'm white and I say so. Next, strengthening the independence of the judiciary. Is that supposed to be a joke? It was America's courts that handed down Dred Scott. It was America's courts that declared a black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect. A court handed down Plessy versus Ferguson, establishing the racist principle of separate but equal. Courts hand down the illegal rulings and unconstitutional convictions against innocent black people, stripping them of their rights, their property, and even their lives. So the UN wants to strengthen the influence of people like Tammy the Mammy who hugged a murderer in open court? Strengthen the independence of these courts, these judges who deliberately let the killers of black people off the hook by throwing out all punishment or giving them lowball sentences that amount to nothing? You want to strengthen that? I'm supposed to be in favor of strengthening that? They recommend that we strengthen the influence of out-and-out white supremacists like the late anything but great Antonin Scalia and his brain-dead pal Sam Alito, as well as Clarence Thomas, a gaggle of judicial sock puppets who never saw an unjust law or an illegal ruling that they didn't like. We need to strengthen their independence. No, if anything, the judges in the United States have too much power, especially over black people. They need to be checked and punished, not strengthened. The problem for us isn't that the U.S. doesn't have functioning courts. The problem is the courts are functioning exactly the way that they were designed to, as nothing more than a rubber-stamped committee for white fiat meant to give a feeble illusion that there is some sort of mechanism in place so that you can appeal when you have a dispute or you can plead for your rights to be upheld, but in reality the courts are just there as judicial theater, and the script always ends the same way. Injustice. Now, the next point could potentially be relevant to us as far as protecting persons in the legal, medical, and healthcare professions. Problem is, we ain't got anywhere near enough of our people in there. The media and other related professions and human rights defenders, sure, we need more Johnny Cochrans, but what we really need are a lot more impartial judges who believe in the rule of law, like Judge Olu Stevens. We also must have media outlets that we own and control, where we can have the same reach and influence as the white media outlets that are demonizing and attacking us and justifying our subjugation every day. Now, point E is another vapid bit of nonsense. They talk about providing humanitarian law training to law enforcement. How many times do we have to say it? You can't retrain a white supremacist. White supremacists cannot be retrained. They can only be punished. The final point is reviewing and reforming laws contributing to or allowing gross violations of international human rights law and serious violations of international humanitarian law. People have been trying to do that, and all these laws are ignored. The problem isn't that the laws to protect black people are not on the books. The problem is the laws are not enforced. They are categorically and deliberately ignored. Also, as far as reviewing laws goes, that's what critical race theory is all about, but you don't see Democrats sticking up for it. And it's for the same reason that the Republicans attack critical race theory. They both want to maintain the racial status quo. So there you have your international standards for reparations. It's supposed to sound very official, but when you look at it, you see it's just weasel words by and large. All of this is being done to create a word salad where reparations, quote unquote, can now be defined as anything other than a check, and it will apply to anyone other than black people who can trace their lineage back to slavery in this country. If you weren't a black slave, that's okay. Reparations applies to you too. But if they have their way, it won't even get that far. They'll instead push us toward accepting intangible, empty gestures, like an apology. And to the extent that there's any talk of compensation, well, they've already set it up so that it's going to include people of color who claim to have been here since before 1900. So you're going to have them saying that Chinese immigrants should be included, and Hispanics who were in the Southwest, and eventually white women because of sexism, and then Irish Americans, Italians, Jewish Americans, the works. And no doubt you'll see Miss Moore back and she'll be telling everybody, well, this is about reshaping the society. We got to transform a lot of things. This is about changing the society, when the reality is it's about keeping the society exactly the way that it is, maintaining the status quo. The goal here is to degenerate and degrade the reparations agenda into nothing more than the same old grab bag for the same old non-black people, which is exactly what they did with affirmative action. And then they'll turn around and say, you know, we actually did do a reparations program. Remember, we gave you reparations and nothing changed for black people. So, you know, it's all your fault. It's clearly not anything we did. We gave you reparations and you see that nothing changed. So now we've atoned for slavery. It's irrelevant now. We did what you said. Nobody's disadvantaging you anymore. Reparations has already been done, and that's the end of it. That's what they're doing here. What's called for is clarity and specificity, but when you have tethers, bootlicks, and opportunists waiting in the wings trying to get something they're not entitled to, the last thing they want is specifics, because that limits who this applies to, and they want it to apply to them. This is what the Reparations Task Force did. You see that it didn't take them very long at all to capitalize on that anyone before the year 1900 thing. They came out the gate swinging on that one. So obviously that's what this is about. Slavery? Well, we can't just be limiting ourselves to slavery. That's very small. Well, hell, we wouldn't even be talking about this without slavery. Well, you know, it's about more than that, you know. And don't be surprised when N Cobra pops up in the proceedings. I would not and will not at all be surprised when I see these Reparations Task Force people in California pop up bumping elbows with them, assuming they haven't already. Out of those 5 things that Moore named, she didn't say that black people must get all of them. In fact, she didn't even say that there's something that black people should get. All she says is that their recommendations must comport with international reparations standards. And then after that, she rattled off 5 forms of reparations without ever saying which, if any of them, are absolutely required. At no point does she say that there's any particular form that reparations must be. There's no demand here, is what I'm trying to say. She's not actually giving any sort of demand or imperative. This is not some term paper being written here. This is the payment of a historical debt for the greatest crime in human history. And she and those in the task force are being as quiet as they can as to what's to be expected. Well, they can't tell us what's going to be in the recommendations, so I guess we should trust them. It's a time-honored tradition of white supremacy. When they lose the war, they immediately begin making every move they can to try to win the peace afterwards. Whenever a law or an initiative is put in place, they'll immediately start trying to bust loopholes in it. As Malcolm said, it's so fixed up and chopped up as to be worthless. That reparations panel did not want to do this. They were forced to do it. And as they saw it, this is about more than slavery. That's how they see it. This is about multiculturalism and heteronormativity and smashing the patriarchy and social privilege. To them, everything is nothing more than a cheap vehicle to push their own personal agendas, which has absolutely nothing to do with us. They're trying to use a historical debt owed to us as nothing more than a Trojan horse for their own agenda, and they're not even being subtle about it. As they see it, they're pushing back against us. That's what this Moore woman thinks. She's pushing back against us. Well, they backed us into a corner. Well, now we're letting them know they're not the boss of us. This isn't about them. As they see it, they can't allow us to make this so narrow as to only apply to us. Why? This is a chance to address the greater good. It just won't address black people who came out of slavery in this country. The vast majority of black people in this country, that's all. Just going to address everybody else, that's all. These people still want to be on good terms with whatever white powers that be. They still want to be invited to the parties at some white politician or businessman's house. They still want white money donors to make contributions to them should they run for political office. They still want to be plugged into the white political machine. That's what they want to do. They want to make sure they don't ruin that. Because you're not going to have any of those things if you're pushing the agenda of the black grassroots. The demand from the grassroots must be clear: to eliminate the anyone before 1900 loophole. This is not and cannot be about African, Caribbean, or Haitian migrants who came over following the Civil War. Reparation is about slavery in the United States. Full stop. Anything other or outside of that is a fraud and a lie. As far as black migrants are concerned, if you showed up after Juneteenth, you ain't included. They volunteered to come here. They must accept the consequences. They certainly wanted to accept whatever rewards they thought they could get. Everything must start and stop with whose lineage goes back to those plantations here in the U.S. Anything else is just the usual piggybacking off of us. And we've carried other people's weight and other people's lies long enough. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Jonte Pegg, DSC Bland, Jonadad Fleming, Cloudwalker Z, and Dondi Waddell. Salute to them, and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.